Okay. Anyways, we're going to get started. We're going to head right into Galatians chapter 5, verse 3. Last week we did verses 1 and 2. And this week we're going to be getting into verse 3, 4, and 5, maybe. I don't know if we'll get that far enough. But as a quick summary, in verses 1 through 12, Paul talks about a life apart from the law. And then we're going to move into a life apart from license for a few verses, and then a life according to the Spirit, and then a life of service. And that'll take us to the end of the book of Galatians. But right here, we're still talking about a life apart from the law. And what we're going to do in verse 3 is we're going to spend a little time in history. And then in verse 4, we're not going to spend a lot of time on verse 4, to be honest with you. Just a little bit of time. But then the majority of our time, if we can get to it, is going to be spent on verse 5, which has some of the most rich analysis I think I've ever really come across as it relates to the concept of revelation, righteousness, and spirit, etc. So we're going to head that direction here as well. So let's start right in. In chapter 5, verse 3, it says, "And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law." Now, Dallas talks about this. Dallas Theological Seminary staff is who we're talking about here. And basically, they explain this as turning to law ruins grace, or law also creates an entirely new obligation. A person is obligated to obey the whole law. And what they're trying to explain here is that the law is a unit. You can't keep part of the law and then say you've kept the law. You either keep the whole law or you don't keep any of the law. It's one unit. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to come back to this in a second, especially when we get Luther's perspective on this. But I just want to introduce you to a concept very quickly in verse 3 from the King James Version, which happens to be, see if I can find it here. Now, there's nothing special about the King James Version. Everybody thinks there's something very special about the King James Version, but it was a translation commissioned by James, the King, James the First. That's about as special as it gets. I think people get all excited about the King James Version because they think since it's older it must be better, but that's not necessarily true. The Vulgate is older than the King James Version. There's other translations. There's the Greek we can go back to. So I don't get too excited about this. However, the King James Version gives an interesting word that I want to focus on here. "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to the whole law." So now this language is a little different. The New American Standard says he is under obligation. But I'd like you to think of the if you say the word obligation, that means that comes across as something that we need to do. A debtor sounds like this bill that we owe, a credit card bill,
Yeah.
and it takes on a little it takes on a little different meaning. So we'll come back to that in just a second. But as what Dallas concludes is, if a person puts himself under any part of it, under the law for justification, then he is a debtor. The entire code with its requirements and its curse. You're indebted to the whole thing if you take a little bit of it. Now, I want to go to this verse real quick. And again, we're going to be slamming through this, but it doesn't matter. It's being recorded, so we can always come back to it if you want, but it kind of allows me to go as fast as I need to because you can always come back and re-listen to it. So, James chapter 2, verse 10 says, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all." Okay, you see that? This explains the concept in, I guess, what I would consider to be much more clear language than is even implied in chapter 5, verse 3 of Galatians. Okay? So, we become a debtor to the whole law. We owe the whole law. If we use any of the law to make us justified, we're indebted to the whole thing. Now what I'd like to do, and that's Dallas's perspective, but where we're going to spend our most time on this particular verse is Calvin. He gives us some history here that is really, really amazing, I think, and it kind of helps understand things a little more. Paul sees two different aspects of circumcision. Okay? First of all, I think it's important, and again, Calvin is our intellectual, and that's why I love Calvin. I love Calvin because he is an intellectual. He asks intellectual questions. I love Luther because he is not an intellectual. He asks practical questions, and I think having them both is extremely important. Let's look at Romans 4:11. This is Paul writing, and he says, "And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited to them." Notice how he's connecting this righteousness with circumcision, but he's connecting it as a seal of righteousness. Now, what Calvin is trying to say here is that Paul refers to circumcision in two different ways. One is as this seal. Here Paul contrasts circumcision with Christ. Let's go back to Galatians again. Here Paul contrasts circumcision with Christ and refers to circumcision as a symbol of grace, not the creator of grace. And so this is what he's trying to say. He's saying circumcision is a symbol, not the creator of grace. Okay? Abraham viewed circumcision as a sacrament which was subservient to faith. Okay? Now this becomes very important. A sacrament subservient to faith. So in other words, it's a representation, it's a symbol, it's a sacrament, but at the end of the day, it can't do what faith does. Faith is what credits to us the righteousness, and the circumcision is a symbol. All right. The false apostles, on the other hand, a second way of looking at circumcision would be the way the false apostles would thinking about this. They abuse circumcision by making it an instrument to destroy or undermine the gospel, and Paul attacks how they corrupted it. So what they're doing is they're using circumcision, what the false apostles are doing, or false teachers are doing, is they're using circumcision, but they're using it in a way to corrupt the gospel. They're saying, this is what allows you to be justified. Well, why Calvin is doing this is a couple different reasons. First of all, he realizes that, remember, Calvin was a great debater. Disputations were the way, were used in many different ways back in the 1500s. These academic disputations were these arguments, and for instance, there was a disputation that Calvin was involved with in Geneva. Now this was a big deal because in Geneva, for instance, the Reformation had not really taken hold. It had taken off, but not taken hold. And so the question was, should Geneva be a reformed city or not? Remember, back in the 1500s, the government and the church were totally entwined. There was no really, you couldn't say I'm a part of Geneva without saying I'm a part of the church. You couldn't say I'm a part of the church without saying you're a part of Geneva. There was no difference. In fact, think of it like this. Currently, birth certificates are held where in the United States?
I don't know.
If you go get your birth certificate, where are you going to go to get it?
The county where you were born.
The county.
Yeah, the government's got it.
You're going to go to the government building. But see, in the 1500s, where would you go get your birth certificate?
At the church.
At the church. See, that's how enmeshed the church and government was. You couldn't be part of one without being part of the other. So, in the 1500s, Calvin's talking about this. What do you think the religion of Geneva was? of course, the religion of Geneva was Roman Catholicism. And so then we have a disputation. And the disputation is this kind of polemic that occurs between Calvin and Catholic theologians, arguing over whether the Reformed Christianity should be the Church of Geneva or Catholicism should be. Now, here's why I bring this all up. If Calvin is arguing, which of course it's kind of the way he thinks, if Calvin is arguing this concept of using circumcision for justification makes no sense, he's going to have to be able to appropriately respond to verses like Romans chapter 4, verse 11, when somebody says, wait a second, he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of righteousness. Wait, the circumcision is the thing that seals our righteousness. Isn't that right? And Calvin would say no. And so you can see within his commentaries, he's like, I know what you're going to say, so now I'm going to argue against it because no, that's not what he means. Okay? All right. I find it fascinating to kind of think through how Calvin thinks. He thinks like an attorney. He does have a legal background. And so you can think of him as a person who is thinking about what your argument or defense is going to be next, and he's like trying to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, making sure that he clarifies things so you can't argue this against him. And some of us think
in that way, he's kind of similar to Paul, because Paul would answer the next question that he thinks you might have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, in some ways he is very similar to Paul. And of course, in some ways, Luther's very similar to Paul, and that Paul could be very, very practical in his teaching as well. Very down to earth. Okay, let's go on. So then, of course, Calvin says, why circumcision? And he explains that it came for a time, and after Christ, it ceased to be a divine institution, and baptism succeeded it. The idea leads into an attack on the sacraments. So, let's think about this. At the time, circumcision was considered like a sacrament. A sacrament is a divine institution. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example so you can clearly understand this. Now, Cheryl, you might be able to even explain this better than me because you grew up Catholic. And is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so you clarify this for me. I did not grow up Catholic, so clarify this for me if I get out of whack. But a sacrament is what we would call a divine institution. And what Calvin is saying here is the circumcision stopped becoming once Christ came, the sacrament of circumcision was no longer a sacrament. It was no longer a divine institution. So let me explain to you what I mean by divine institution. He uses the example of baptism, for instance. Of course, both of these, Calvin and Luther, would also consider the Eucharist or communion to also be a divine institution. And so, to bring this up to current day, I want you to be able to understand what's really happening. I want you to be able to understand what a sacrament is. And the easiest way to explain what a sacrament is the concept of the Eucharist. Now, remember, a sacrament is a divine institution. There is divinity within the act. And so Eucharist is communion. And so somebody like Luther and Calvin, in different ways, I'm not going to go into the idiosyncrasies of how they look at the Eucharist, but in different ways, think that the Eucharist is still a sacrament, which would mean, for instance, in Luther's case, he uses this big word, we use this big word called consubstantiation to make sense out of what he thinks. He really means that when you have the bread and you have the wine, that's actually, in an environment of communion, that's actually the essence of God. It's not bread. It's the Spirit of God. It is divine. Okay? Now, I was brought up in a church that when we took the elements, we were doing it in remembrance. It was a memorial. Okay? But remember, in Catholicism, it goes way beyond that. And it says, no, the bread, when the priest raises the bread up over his head, or the wine up over his head, in that moment, that bread turns into the body of Jesus Christ, into the blood of Jesus Christ.
So did Luther still believe that? Or did he still believe it after he caused the Reformation?
No, not exactly. But he also didn't think of it like remembrance either. So Catholicism would say, I raise my hands, and that becomes Jesus. Luther would say the elements have the Spirit, the best way I can explain it, at least right now, has the Spirit of God in them. But man does not make it change. So this whole raising them over your head thing, he was against. However, more modern day, like a Christian church, for instance, might say, when I say Christian church, I mean Christian church in the denominational sense. They might say, no, this is just a remembrance, okay? Now, you can see what they mean now by a divine institution here. They literally thought God is in this. Some people still, clearly the Catholic Church still believes God is in this. Baptism the same way. There's two different ways of looking at baptism. The one way of looking at baptism would be, there's more than one, there's more than two, but two general ways. One is that the baptism, in other words, you going down into the water, God is actually present right there. God's presence is right there. However, other churches say no, baptism, the actual physical act of baptism, isn't a sacrament per se, in that it's not a divine institution. Instead, what it is it's an act, it's an outward act that signifies an inward change or represents an inward change, okay? In other words, these churches would say, it doesn't matter if you get baptized or not. You're still going to go to heaven. Faith is what causes your righteousness. Faith is how you're justified. By being baptized, you're just doing in obedience. It's an act of obedience, not an act of salvation. Clearly, someone that thinks that baptism is actually a sacrament would believe, no, salvation is part of the baptismal experience. Okay? All right. Now, for those of you that weren't brought up Catholic, this might be a different way of looking at things, but it's important to understand the heritage behind our Protestantism. And here's why. Calvin goes on to say that he defines the sacraments as efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church, by which divine life is dispensed to you. So, remember, sacraments have divinity in them, have God in them. It's how the divine life is dispensed to you. Do you see how strong this language is? This is how you come into contact with God, is through these sacraments. Okay? That's the Roman Catholic belief. And to a certain extent, still part of Calvin and Luther's theology at the time. Okay. So, what Luther did that was so kind of heretical to the Roman Catholic Church is there were 7 sacraments that the Roman Catholic Church believed in. What he did is he moved these 7 sacraments and no, there's only 2 sacraments. Okay? And so he suggested that baptism and the Eucharist were the 2 sacraments. There weren't 7 sacraments like Thomas Aquinas would suggest. There's 2 sacraments. Now, these 7 sacraments, you would add things like, okay, you'd certainly have baptism and Eucharist in these 7 sacraments, but you would also have confirmation, penance, anointing, like of the sick, ordination, and marriage, matrimony. Okay? So if you add these 2 to these 5, you get the 7 sacraments. Luther says, no, there's only 2 sacraments. What what Calvin is saying is he's saying, wait, circumcision was a sacrament that was replaced when Christ came. This divine institution is no longer necessary since Christ came. Now, you can see the importance because he's kind of giving support system here to this, wait, these sacraments are no longer necessary since Christ came. Okay? However, and some of us would say now, 0 sacraments. Okay, some Christian churches would say, now wait a second, this isn't about God being in baptism or the Eucharist. This is a memorial. This is in remembrance. This is an act of obedience. These aren't really God showing up in the water, God showing up in the loaf or in the wine. Now, we'll finish this out by the home run, nail in the coffin point that Calvin's trying to make. He says, the papists contrived the opus operatum, the work worked by which men merit the grace of God. And so, what he's trying to do is he's trying to connect the fact that the Galatians were trying to use this act of circumcision as a way to get to salvation. Okay, so now, here's the home run moment for Calvin. Calvin is saying, he's going to the Galatians, and notice how he's comparing this circumcision to a sacrament, a symbol. It's not the creator of grace, it's a symbol. It should be subservient to grace. Then, of course, what he does is he takes it one step further, and he says, the papists contrived the opus operatum, which means the work worked by which men merit grace of God. So he's trying to suggest that these sacraments that up here are like circumcision. Okay? And what he does is he actually then quotes from the Council of Trent. Well, the Council of Trent was around the 1550s, was where the Catholics got together to try to figure out how are they going to respond to this Protestant heresy, because they thought it was heresy, and they still do. And let me read a quote from that Council of Trent. It says this, if any man shall say that the sacraments of the new law do not contain the grace which they signify, or do not confer grace upon those who do not oppose an obstacle to it, as if they were only external signs of grace or righteousness received by faith, let him be cursed. Okay, this is a Catholic paragraph. In a Catholic paragraph suggesting that if any man says that these sacraments do not contain the grace that creates the righteousness, you shall be cursed. Wow. This is what Calvin was fighting against at the time. Now, this is the same thing that we're fighting against today. In other words, the Galatians used circumcision to become their law. But it was a sacrament, a symbol. It wasn't the creator. The Catholics used these 7 sacraments as their law, would be Calvin's perspective. Now, Calvin gets a little trouble with this language because he says there really is only 2 sacraments, the Eucharist and baptism. Some would say, no, you can use the Eucharist and the baptism to also create a law. So really there are 0 sacraments. And in other words, there's 0 actions that create divine grace. But instead, they are acts done in obedience and in remembrance for something that is inherently already done via solely of faith. Okay? Now, why do I explain all that? I explain all that mainly because I found, we spend 15, 20 minutes on that, but I found without me understanding this, understanding theology as it relates to Thomas Aquinas, as it relates to Catholic theology, and even as it relates to some of the things Luther and Calvin say, if we don't understand these concepts, it gets very confusing to me. And it doesn't make any sense. And so by having a little background on what was really happening, I think it does help some. So we're going to plow. Any questions on that? We're going to plow on through the next thing.
No, that makes sense.
Okay.
At least for me.
Now what I want to do is I want to talk just briefly about Luther over this one verse. And it says here, I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. Luther talks about this from a negative perspective and a positive perspective. In other words, negatively, we'll just use this bottom rung right here. Negatively, he focuses on this concept of a debtor. And then positively, he focuses on this the prospects of the whole law. In other words, as a debtor, although you are righteous, you are not free from the law. But by this act, you are debtors of the law. And this is where this King James Version comes in again. In other words, the more you try to satisfy the law and be set free from it, the more you trap yourselves in its yoke, so it's more power to condemn you. You're indebted to it like a treadmill you can't get off of. That's what they mean by this debtedness. It's like you can't, you know, the more you try, the more you got to try. And the more you try, the more you realize you don't have it. It's similar to the saying, the more you know you don't know. The more you try to keep the law, the more you realize you can't get any closer keeping the law. And then, of course, in a really cool little line, which Luther's really good at, he says this. It's like washing your feet with dirt. That's what's this like. I think that's an incredible little metaphor. Finally, the whole law, if you accept Moses on one point, you must accept him on all. Some people try and bind you, and then, of course, from a very practical perspective, Luther explains that some people try to bind you with the laws that they like the best. And then he goes on to say, Deuteronomy 34:6. This is a very interesting way of looking at this particular verse. Deuteronomy 34:6 says, but let's just look at it real quick. This is kind of funny, I think.
Now, are you still talking about the debtor piece?
So what I'm talking about is this concept now of the whole law, which they're both. When we try to follow the law, we are a debtor to it. And when we try to follow the law, we have to follow the whole law. Okay?
Right.
Deuteronomy 34:6 says this, and he buried him in the valley of Moab. Who we're talking about is Moses in this particular verse. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite of Beth Peor. So look at this. But no man knows his burial place to this day. And what Luther does with this phrase is say, let Moses be dead and buried, and let no one know Moses' grave's location. In other words, let the law be dead and buried, and let us not know where it's even buried, is what he's trying to connect here. Finally, he finishes this out by saying, Paul says that the law of Moses is a denial of Christ. Of course, why was the law given? We've been down this path before. Because the law is what led us to Christ. But now that Christ has been revealed and we believe, we're no longer under that law. Okay, some really cool, interesting ways of looking at this particular verse, especially as Calvin kind of expresses it in these concept of sacraments, and as we today continue to try to put some sort of divinity in undivine things. Now, today, we could be trying, we might think that divinity would be in things like, work or whatever other thing we think makes us happy or divine. But I think the metaphors really work as we continue to try to find these things to make divine, when in fact there is only one divine. That you don't find divine in things. They don't create the salvation. It's an internal process, not an external process. Okay, back to Galatians chapter 5. Go ahead.
Derek, when Christ said, "Do this in remembrance of me," Protestants and Luther went back to the Scripture and keyed in on his choice of words there and said, wait a minute, there's no human entity that's involved in this, it's just a remembrance thing?
Yeah. Luther would have keyed in on, see, you remember, Jesus did say, do this in remembrance of me, right?
Right.
But he also said, this is my body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So a Catholic, Roman Catholic would say, this is my body. He says this is his body. It really is his body. Somebody like the Christian church would say, he says this is in remembrance of him. This isn't really his body. Well, it says it's really his body, so there becomes the issue. And then Luther somehow with consubstantiation comes down in the middle somewhere.
Okay.
Okay? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I just didn't know where Luther landed finally.
He landed on what we would call consubstantiation, which is not, it's not that his actual flesh is in the bread, and it's not that it's just a memory of bygone past or something to remember, but instead the Spirit of God is actually in the elements, but it's not his flesh and blood, and it's not just a memory. So he's kind of in the middle.
Okay.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's go on to verse 4. We're going to spend just a few minutes here, and then the rest of your time is going to be on verse 5, which I really, really have enjoyed. Okay, here it is, verse 4. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified the law. You have fallen from grace. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on this. Because first of all, I think it's critical here to see a couple different views. Dallas is adamant about the fact that this severing from Christ, this falling from grace, is not a possible loss of salvation. For grace is referred to not as salvation itself, but as a method of salvation. And so this falling from the method of salvation is different than falling from salvation. Grace isn't salvation.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Okay? Now, to be fair, I'm not exactly sure Luther totally agreed with this. And Calvin is not very clear on this. He would think, well, Luther would come out. See, you got to realize, Luther was so tormented by this salvation thing. He was so tormented by, can I do good enough to be good enough? For so long that it's almost like for somebody like Luther, it made it better to say, if I do anything by the law, then I'm going to hell. In other words, it was kind of like that ridiculous truth that helped. It gave him comfort to say that. Okay? It gave him comfort because then he knew there was no possible thing he could do that would be bad enough to make him go to hell, or that would be good enough to get him better righteousness. Because why? Because anything related to the law would send me to hell, so I would never go there. So Luther's perspective here is one that would look at this in a very positive light and say, if I believe any law can get me to heaven, then I am going to hell. Now, I don't know that he goes that extreme, but that's the language that's kind of used in his commentaries. I think Dallas probably gets this closer to being right, as far as just a very practical way of looking at this particular verse. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace. This would be more like this. You're severing yourself from the grace and the results of grace. Now, of course, Calvin would be hard-pressed to really make sense out of this like Luther did, because Calvin wouldn't believe you could possibly lose your salvation.
Right. He would have said that those who are chosen in Christ will be kept from renouncing the gospel.
Yes.
God will keep them from doing that.
Right. So he kind of like sticks feet on both sides of the fence in a way. And so he doesn't have a lot to add to this verse because of his own systematic theology that he feels like in many ways he has to keep consistent. That's why he calls it systematic. Okay, so, but again, I think Dallas does a great job of explaining what this really is. It makes more logical sense to me. You can choose whatever you want to think. You can believe, you can use critical thinking to come up with whatever you want to. But it seems to me personally that if you read the verses and you realize, wait, this grace is not grace doesn't create salvation. Faith creates salvation. So if you're falling from grace, that's not necessarily falling from salvation. It says falling from grace. Interestingly enough, one more point on this before we move on to the next verse, is that normally when people, this is really the irony of this particular verse. Normally when people talk about someone falling from grace? Let's do this because I think it's funny. Normally, when people talk about someone falling from grace, it usually means what?
Well, they've lost their salvation
And why would that be?
because they had some sin big enough
Exactly.
that God said, sorry.
They haven't lived up. They've sinned too much. Okay? Now, this is what's really, really ironic about this language we use in Protestantism, falling from grace. Well, they've fallen from grace because they haven't lived up. They've sinned too much. The irony here is Paul says, no, you fall from grace when you try to live up. Now, that is quite an interesting irony, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Paul, go ahead, Lisa.
Just the process of trying, for me, starts the lies in my mind.
Yeah,
The process of trying really is the initiator for those lies.
right. So again, the huge irony is this. Today, many times, we think someone falls from grace when they don't live up, when they've sinned too much. And Paul is saying, wait a second. You fall from grace when you try to live up.
Oh, that's great.
Very, very powerful irony. Okay. Now we're going to head into verse 5.
Listen to the way Phillips translates that. If you try to be justified by the law, you automatically cut yourself off from the power of Christ. You
Yes.
put yourself outside the range of his grace.
Yeah.
Say
That's
that
very
again,
good.
Cheryl?
Say it again, Cheryl. Say it as loud as you can.
Okay. If you try to be justified by the law, you automatically cut yourself off from the power of Christ.
Yeah, I like
Semicolon.
that.
It's of no use, like we talked about last week, Derek.
That's right. It's of no use.
Yeah, that's right. It's of no use. You put yourself outside the range of his grace.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay, now we're going to quickly move into verse 5. This verse is amazingly powerful. But like many of these verses we've been looking at, isn't exactly powerful on its face until we start really digging into it. Look at this verse. For we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. Now, what in the world does that mean? For we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness.
Oh, come on. That echo.
I don't
Feedback
have any idea
from
why
you,
it does
Derek.
that. Is that you, Kathy, you think?
Maybe. Mute me.
All right, I'm going to mute you. Testing. It's not you, Kathy.
Nope, it's not Kathy.
Testing. It's not Cheryl. Testing. It's Lisa.
It's Lisa.
I have no idea why it's Lisa, but Lisa, you cut off for some reason. Testing.
You've fallen from grace.
Testing.
Can't hear me?
Testing.
Oh.
Hold
can't
on,
hear me?
Lisa. Yeah, Lisa, don't say anything. I'm trying. Testing.
Yes, I can hear.
All right. I turned her off and turned her back on, and all of a sudden now my echo's gone. So.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you, Lisa.
Yeah, it's fine.
But am I echoing?
No, I was
No.
Or are
echoing.
those just...
Okay, let's
I
get.
thought they were the voices. Voices in my mind were coming... All the voices in my mind were coming
Yeah.
across now.
Okay, Sybil, here we go.
In just a second, we'll do some sort of demon removal thing here.
That's
Okay.
good.
Sybil is happening.
So let's get on to verse 5 here. For we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. Interestingly enough, just as this verse here in verse 3, Calvin spent an enormous amount of time on verse 3. It meant a lot to him. And we spent a lot of time on verse 3 as it related to Calvin, and we can see why it really does make a lot of sense, especially in the 1500s, and even as it relates
I
today.
wonder
as
why
we
my
think about it.
translation has left out by faith.
Well, that's
Mine just says eagerly wait for the hope.
I have no idea.
And mine's actually the New Geneva, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, hold on one second. Let me try another version here. King James says, "For we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith." So it does use the word faith. And the New American Standard modifies it just a tad by changing the word.
Yeah, they change it at the end.
Let me try to go back to the New American Standard. Okay, so here we go. As I was mentioning, Calvin spent so much time on verse 3, it was like it really connected with him. This particular verse really connects with Luther. So we'll spend just 2 seconds on Dallas and Calvin here, and then we're going to spend the next 15 minutes on Luther, and then we'll be finished up. All right, Dallas says this about this verse. Here again, this is the verse we're looking at. "For we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness." Focuses on the fact that righteousness for which we hope will be fully realized at the coming of Christ. So the word hope in the New Testament many, many times is an eschatological word. It's a word that has to do with the second coming of Christ or the coming of Christ. So in this particular case, this is how Dallas looks at this particular verse. "The inward forensic righteousness which began at justification will be transformed into an outward righteousness at glorification." So what we're waiting for is this hope of righteousness, this hope of completed perfection that happens when we go to heaven, when we are glorified. It's not just an inward righteousness by justification here on earth, but it's a total, complete perfection in heaven that where we move from sanctification to total glorification. Okay? This is how Dallas would look at it. Calvin points out that the righteousness depends on faith, is obtained through the Spirit, not ceremonies. Interesting, isn't it? So, on what does Dallas say? Dallas says this hope is related to the coming of Christ. So what does Calvin say? Calvin says this hope is related to faith. Look, the word faith is here. It is by faith. That's what we're seeing right here. By faith. It's by faith, not a ceremony. Now, why would he say that? Because, again, he's poking at the popes. Mm-hmm. Okay? This isn't by some ceremony. He refers again back to the Catholic issue. So all that is necessary for obtaining righteousness is simple faith. That's all Calvin has to say about this verse. This is about faith. This is not about ceremony. This is about faith. This is not about some papist sacrament. Luther, on the other hand, this verse can absolutely hits Luther in a couple of different ways. And what he explains is, no, this righteousness we're talking about, actually, this hope of righteousness we're talking about, it has two meanings. Yes, okay, fine. I agree, he says. This hope we're talking about, I'm okay with suggesting that this is regarding the coming of Christ. I'll give that to you. And the way he would say that is, I am raised up in hope against sin and wait for the full consummation of perfect righteousness in heaven. And this is how Luther would explain this. But here is where the fun part comes in. He says, no, it's more than that. Because we can't ignore, and I really think this makes sense. Look, for we through the Spirit by faith are waiting for the hope of righteousness. It's almost like Luther is saying, wait a second. Okay, I get the fact that we're going to be glorified, but Romans chapter 3 also says, via the Spirit, we are righteous right now. The righteousness is imputed right now. So yes, there is this hope that occurs because someday we will be glorified, but there's this present day application of this verse as well. And this present day application is what we're going to spend our time on for the rest of our time here. And this is something that isn't referred to by Dallas or Calvin, even though Dallas and Calvin, neither one really are even on the same page with the way they look at this verse, which is, again, absolutely fascinating. Okay, so here we go. This second way of looking at this hope is that we wait in the Spirit through faith for the righteousness that we hope for, which will be revealed when the Lord chooses to give it. All right, that's really, really powerful. I want to try to make this very clear. You know, so we're going to call this present day application, and then I'm going to change the slide over, and we're going to spend the rest of our time on this present-day application of verse 5. And hang with me. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do here at the end.
You're kind of a Bible nerd.
Excuse me?
You're kind of a Bible nerd.
Yeah, that is true. So who knows? Now, let's think about it, though. Let's say, for instance, that, so I want to give you a glimpse of what he means by this. We wait in the Spirit through faith for the righteousness we hope for, which will be revealed when the Lord chooses to give it. So, to give an introduction to this concept, we have faith, okay? And that faith justifies us. But notice, even when that faith justifies us, we wake up and it's like, okay, I know in faith I'm justified, but
You forget.
am I really justified? You see what I'm saying? So in faith, I know I'm justified, but am I really? I don't see it. Okay, I think it. It's like I believe it, but I can't see it.
I don't feel it.
And I don't feel it. Okay? So, now let me read this let me read this sentence again in light of what I just explained. We wait in the Spirit through faith for the righteousness we hope for, which will be revealed when the Lord chooses to give it. So what he's saying is that we believe in faith that we're justified, but we don't quite get it yet. And that getting it only happens when the Lord decides to reveal it. And I would add to it that this getting it is, we may get it today in one area of our life and tomorrow in another area. Okay?
That's
so
good.
I don't think we get it like in totality. I think we get glimpses of it, and God reveals it to us when He decides. When the Lord reveals it to us when He decides to. So let me read you I'd like to read you a section here. Your righteousness ought to surmount. Hold on 1 second. Let me see what I missed here. Okay, yeah. Your righteousness ought to surmount all feeling of sin. That is, your righteousness or justification to which you cling is not based on your own feeling, but on hoping that it will be revealed when the Lord chooses. So you must not judge the feeling of sin that troubles and terrifies you, but by the promise and the doctrine of faith, by which Christ is promised to you as your perfect and everlasting righteousness. Thus the hope of the afflicted residing in your inner feelings is stirred up by faith in the midst of all terrors and feelings of sin, the hope that we are righteous. Moreover, what we do not see now, we hope in time will be made perfectly clear, perfectly revealed to us. So what he's saying is that this righteousness that we have isn't perfectly revealed to us yet, but we wait in hope for that revelation to understand, I guess, the intricacies of this righteousness that's in our life.
Would you read the sentence about the affliction part again? Because that feels like the challenges or gifts.
Sure, yeah, definitely. Thus the hope of the afflicted residing in our inner feelings is stirred up by faith in the midst of all our terrors and feelings of sin, the hope that we are righteous.
Yeah, because we get to the end of ourselves, and where else can I go but you? And to
so
me, that's usually when revelation happens.
Yes. Yep.
And so we can know we are righteous, but then what he's suggesting is that there's this hope of righteousness. In other words, this is kind of something we can know in our head, but this is something we hope to experience in our life. Okay?
Yeah.
So, in other words, we don't always feel righteous unless the hope is in the revelation of righteousness here and now when the Lord chooses. We don't lose salvation because revelation is not revealed yet in a particular area of our life. This is something we got to be very clear on. We are justified, and our salvation comes through our knowing, not through our feeling of experiencing that righteousness, because that righteousness where we experience it or feel it existentially really can only happen through revelation, and that happens when the Lord chooses. Now, I know I'm throwing out, again, a little more theory, so I'm going to get more and more practical here in the next few minutes.
Okay, so you said justification comes through knowing, not feeling.
Exactly. And we are waiting for the hope of righteousness. In other words, the experiencing of it, because just because we know it doesn't mean we feel it or experience it. But our hope is living in this place that says God, our Lord, will reveal it to us when He so chooses.
And
I think, go ahead.
The faith. That's the faith. When I don't feel it, I still know it, and that's faith.
So now, what he does a really, really good job. I love this. What he does is he does a faith and hope side-by-side column. Now, he doesn't do this, but that's how I'm going to do it.
I'm sure he would have thought about it.
Yeah.
I bet he would have.
So what is faith? Faith is based on understanding. Hope is based on our will. Faith tells us what to be done. Hope exhorts us or stirs us up, like emotionally. Faith has its object in truth. Hope has its object in a promise. I think you'll start seeing the connections here. Faith is in the beginning. Hope comes after. Faith is a teacher. Hope is more of a captain. So, in summary, we believe and are justified by faith in spirit and wait for the hope of our righteousness to be revealed. Okay? So, I'm going to say it like this. My note here. This is how I like to summarize it. By faith, we began. By hope, we continue. And by revelation, we obtain the whole. Okay? So by faith, it begins. By hope, we continue. And by revelation, we obtain it. We experience it. It becomes an experiential part of our life. Okay? Now, what I would like you to see here is this connection. Faith is truth. Hope is what we would say, he would call exhortation, or prompting, encouragement, stirring up. Faith is what we know. Hope is what we feel. And love is what we do. Faith is what we know. Hope is the encouragement to move. Revelation occurs, and out of that extension becomes love. And so what Luther does marvelously here is he connects faith, hope, and love in order and in its I should say in the work that it does, in what it does. And faith is what we know. Hope is how we feel or encouraged. You can just, even by the word hope, it does something like offer encouragement. And love is what comes out of this faith and hope in action. As you can see very clearly here, he lines up very clearly exactly what we talk about in Lives Transforming every week, which is faith is based on what we think. Hope exhorts us in emotional life, a healthy emotional life that moves us to the action, which ultimately all action, from a biblical perspective, all the do is about love. We know love is definitely not a feeling, and love is also not something that we think. Love is something that does. Love is Jesus dying on the cross. Love is action. And so he does, I think, a masterful job of being able to explain. Now, let's look at this. Verse 5, for we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. This revelation that occurs, we don't know when the revelation occurs in any given moment. But we do have that hope of that revelation, and we know what it's like to experience that revelation. And through the Holy Spirit, by faith, we are waiting for the hope of righteousness that extends out, then, Luther says, into this action of love.
And out of that revelation changes us from the inside, and we act, we do, because God has revealed it to us rather than just fake it till you make it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's how he says it. These three things then coexist in the faithful. Faith, which teaches us truth. Hope, which endures and overcomes and encourages. And love, which does everything good. And
Yeah,
finally,
I would add,
go ahead,
I would just
Lisa.
add to that it really is a supernatural process when that revelation happens that
Yeah.
moves us to act in love, especially in, that's when you say, well, I don't know where that came from. It wasn't from me.
Yeah.
In the most difficult of situations. Yeah.
And as you know, in this first phrase, we through the Spirit, that's the supernatural. We through the Spirit, by faith, wait for the hope of righteousness to be, to land in us experientially. I'll read this last paragraph for you from Luther, and then we'll be done. He says this in summary. Believing in him, you are justified. It is not your reason. It is not your feelings that you believe in him that you are justified. It is not your reason and feelings that tell you this when you are tempted, but the Word of God. Moreover, in the midst of these conflicts and terrors, which often return to try you, we wait patiently through hope for righteousness. Now again, he doesn't say we wait patiently for righteousness, meaning we don't have it. He means we wait patiently through the hope for righteousness to be revealed. And then he goes on to say, which you have now by faith, even though it is only an imperfect beginning so far, wait for it to be revealed and made perfect. But you will say, I do not feel myself to have any righteousness, or at least I feel very little. You must not feel, but believe that you have righteousness. Very strong language.
Yeah, that's good. What is that from in Luther's work? What's that from?
This is Luther's commentary on Galatians.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and he ends it by saying, "But you will say, when you're afflicted, when you're conflicted, when you're attacked, you will say, I do not feel myself to have any righteousness, or at least I feel very little. You must not feel, but believe that you have righteousness."
That's
Anyways,
huge.
yeah, very, very strong. Okay, anything? We're getting ready to wrap up. Let's go around the room real quick. Cheryl, can you still hear us?
I can.
Okay.
I can even see you.
Oh, great. Anything to add to what we talked about this evening that kind of popped into your head?
No, not to add. Well, kind of, where Lisa said to make sure that we understood it was supernatural when love happens. I think from beginning to end it's supernatural. We know by faith because he's the author of our faith.
Yeah.
He who began a good work in us is faithful to complete it. To me, he's just in the whole process of doing what Luther so brilliantly helped us see. It just makes great sense to me to see that written out that way.
Great.
But all supernatural.
Kathy, how about you?
I'm just overwhelmed by all that. And hearing it in Luther's words, I don't know if it's just the language that he uses makes it clearer, or maybe I'm just ready to hear it differently. But that's really huge for me.
Lisa, anything else to add?
Yeah, I appreciate the context of looking at it with the way it is on the graph there, the TEA, and to really realize that action is about a supernatural intervention and not about me trying any harder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And finally, Brent?
Yeah, to me, the whole thing, Lisa had said something, the whole revelation thing when God moves in and we know it's nothing that we did. And I go back to Sarah and so many other miracles where God reveals himself through the impossible or the incomprehensible, when we can find peace in the storm, when we can find kindness to the unkind, when we can love the unlovable, when we can find joy in dire situations, when we can find self-control when everything is around us is out of control. Those situations to me are the revelation that God just, boom, there it is, I am here. Because I couldn't do that on my own.
Yeah.
I couldn't be those things without him. Did that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll pray. Lord, thank you so much for your revelation even tonight. And also these encouraging words from everybody, from the insights you've given to the people at Dallas, the insights you gave to Calvin over how we continue even today trying to make sacraments out of things, to make divine things out of undivine things, and reminding us of that. And also, of course, Luther, and being able to wait patiently in the hope of the righteousness to be revealed. Being able to wait patiently in the hope, knowing through faith we are righteous, but also waiting patiently for it to be revealed when you choose so. Because what we know is that when you choose to reveal it, it's in that moment that is the most effective time for me to hear it, for us to hear it. That's why your timing is perfect. That's why our patience is necessary. Thank you for what you've revealed to us tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.